The ancient walls of Ravenshollow Castle had witnessed countless secrets throughout the centuries, but none quite like the one that would soon shake the very foundations of the Kingdom of Eldoria. Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of the East Wing, watching the morning mist roll across the emerald lawns that stretched toward the distant mountains. His father, King Edward, had been acting strangely for weeks now, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was brewing beneath the surface of their carefully orchestrated royal life. Alexander had always been the observant one among the royal children. While his younger sister Princess Isabella spent her days painting in the gardens, and his brother Prince Marcus focused on his military training, Alexander found himself naturally drawn to the intricate web of politics and relationships that governed their kingdom. At 28, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to notice the subtle shifts in behavior that others missed entirely. It was this gift that first alerted him to the change in his stepmother, Lady Victoria. She had married his father 3 years ago, following the tragic death of Queen Margaret in a riding accident. Victoria had been his mother's closest friend, a confidant who had supported the royal family through their darkest hours. Her marriage to King Edward had been seen as a natural progression, a union that brought comfort and stability to a grieving kingdom. But lately, Victoria's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Alexander noticed how she would excuse herself abruptly from family dinners, claiming sudden headaches or urgent correspondence to attend to. Her usually impeccable composure would crack for just a moment when certain topics were discussed, particularly anything relating to the kingdom's financial affairs or the upcoming trade negotiations with the neighboring realm of Astoria. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Alexander was reviewing diplomatic documents in the library when he heard raised voices echoing from his father's private study. The thick oak doors muffled most of the conversation, but Alexander could clearly distinguish his father's deep, authoritative tone arguing with Victoria's usually melodious voice, which now carried an edge of desperation he had never heard before. "You cannot possibly understand the position this puts me in," King Edward's voice carried through the corridors. "The council is already questioning every decision I make. If they were to discover..." Victoria's response was too quiet to make out, but the urgency in her tone was unmistakable. Alexander found himself moving closer to the study, his diplomatic training having taught him that information was often the most valuable currency in royal circles. He positioned himself near a tapestry that concealed a small alcove, a hiding spot he had discovered as a child during games of hide and seek with his siblings. The letters were never supposed to surface. Victoria's voice became clearer as she moved closer to the door. "I thought they had been destroyed years ago. If Lord Blackthorne has them, he could ruin everything we've worked for." Lord Blackthorne. Alexander's blood ran cold at the mention of that name. Lord Roderick Blackthorne was perhaps the most dangerous man in all of Eldoria, a nobleman whose wealth and influence rivaled even that of the crown. He had been conspicuously absent from court for the past several months, claiming to be managing his estates in the Northern Territories. But Alexander had always suspected that Blackthorne's absences were strategic, times when he was gathering intelligence or consolidating power away from the watchful eyes of the royal court. What exactly did these letters contain? King Edward's voice was strained, and Alexander could hear the weight of kingship bearing down on his father's shoulders. "You told me your correspondence with him was purely diplomatic, related to the trade routes through his lands." There was a long pause, and Alexander held his breath, pressing himself further into the shadows of the alcove. When Victoria finally spoke, her words sent a chill through the prince's entire body. "They weren't just diplomatic, Edward. Roderick and we had an understanding long before I married you. An understanding that went far beyond politics or trade." Her voice broke slightly. "The letters detail arrangements we made, agreements about how certain policies would be influenced, how certain appointments would be made. If the council sees them, they'll see it as treason," King Edward finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria, what have you done?" Alexander's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. His stepmother, the woman who had comforted his family after his mother's death, who had seemed to love his father genuinely, had been secretly conspiring with one of the kingdom's most powerful and potentially dangerous lords. The implications were staggering. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," Victoria continued, and Alexander could hear tears in her voice now. "When Margaret died, I was grieving too. Roderick offered comfort, offered solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. The kingdom was in chaos. The treasury was depleted from the war with Moravia, and you were in no state to make the hard decisions that needed to be made. So you made them for me? Behind my back, the hurt in King Edward's voice was palpable. I made them for the kingdom. Victoria's voice rose defensively. Every decision, every arrangement was designed to strengthen Eldoria's position. The grain shipments from Blackthorn's estates that prevented famine in the eastern provinces, the military supplies that helped us win the border conflicts, the trade agreements that brought prosperity back to our people. All of that came through my negotiations with Roderick. Alexander leaned against the cold stone wall, his head spinning. On one hand, if what Victoria was saying was true, her actions had potentially saved the kingdom during its darkest hour. On the other hand, she had been operating a shadow diplomacy behind the king's back, making deals and arrangements that could be seen as treasonous by those who would seek to use such information against the crown. And now Blackthorn wants to collect on these favors, King Edward said, his voice heavy with understanding. The letters aren't just evidence of past arrangements, they're leverage for future ones. He's demanding that you appoint his nephew, Lord Geoffrey, as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Victoria admitted. He says if you don't comply, he'll release the letters to the noble council and claim that I was acting as his agent within the royal household from the beginning. The Chancellor of the Exchequer position had been vacant for 2 months, since the previous Chancellor died of a sudden fever. It was one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom, with direct control over the royal treasury and significant influence over economic policy. If Lord Blackthorn could install his nephew in such a position, he would effectively control the financial heartbeat of Eldoria. Alexander heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly moved away from the alcove, pretending to examine a particularly ornate suit of armor that stood in the corridor. The study door opened, and Victoria emerged, her face composed but pale. She barely glanced at Alexander as she walked past, her silk gown rustling against the stone floor. King Edward appeared in the doorway moments later, looking older than Alexander had ever seen him. Their eyes met, and, for a moment, the king seemed about to speak. Then, he simply nodded gravely and retreated back into his study, closing the door with a soft but final click. Alexander stood alone in the corridor, his mind churning with questions and implications. He had stumbled upon a secret that could potentially destroy his family and throw the kingdom into chaos. But he had also discovered that his stepmother, whatever her methods, had been working to protect and strengthen Eldoria during its most vulnerable period. The question now was what to do with this dangerous knowledge. Should he confront Victoria directly? Should he inform his father that he had overheard their conversation? Or should he conduct his own investigation into Lord Blackthorn's activities and try to find a way to neutralize the threat before it could explode into a full-scale political crisis? As Alexander made his way back to his chambers, he passed the portrait gallery where paintings of previous kings and queens gazed down with solemn dignity. He paused before the portrait of his mother, Queen Margaret, remembering her wisdom and her fierce protective instinct for both her family and her kingdom. What would she have done in this situation? The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows through the castle windows when Alexander finally reached his private chambers. His personal secretary, Thomas, was waiting with a stack of correspondence and the day's schedule of appointments. But Alexander's mind was elsewhere, already formulating plans and considering options. "Your Highness," Thomas said, bowing slightly, "Lord Blackthorn's messenger arrived this morning. He requests an audience with you at your earliest convenience. He's currently staying at the Golden Griffin Inn in the village." Alexander felt his blood freeze. Lord Blackthorn was here, in their territory, while he held devastating leverage over the royal family. This was no coincidence. This was a calculated move in what was clearly a much larger game. "Thank you, Thomas," Alexander managed to say calmly. "Please send word that I'll meet with Lord Blackthorn tomorrow afternoon in the Blue Salon. And Thomas, I want you to discreetly inquire about Lord Blackthorn's retinue. How many men did he bring? How long do they plan to stay?" As Thomas bowed and left to carry out these instructions, Alexander moved to his window and looked out over the kingdom he would one day inherit. Somewhere out there, Lord Blackthorn was planning his next move in this dangerous game. And somewhere within these very walls, Victoria was struggling with secrets that could topple everything they held dear. The game had begun, and Alexander realized he was the only one who truly understood what was at stake. The knowledge he had gained today would change everything. But first, he needed to understand exactly who he could trust and what Lord Blackthorn's true intentions were. The fate of the kingdom of Eldoria might very well depend on the decisions he made in the next few days. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the castle in twilight shadows, Alexander began to formulate a plan. He would play the game, but he would play it by his own rules. And he would do whatever it took to protect his family and his kingdom from the storm that was about to break over Ravenshollow Castle. The Golden Griffin Inn sat at the heart of Millbrook Village, a picturesque establishment that had served travelers and merchants for over 2 centuries. Its timber-framed walls and thatched roof gave it the appearance of a quaint country inn, but Alexander knew that some of the kingdom's most significant political deals had been struck within its private dining rooms. As his carriage rolled through the cobblestone streets toward his meeting with Lord Blackthorne, Alexander reviewed everything he had learned in the past 24 hours. Thomas had proven invaluable in gathering intelligence. Lord Blackthorne had arrived with a retinue of 12 men, including his personal secretary, 2 bodyguards, and what appeared to be several clerks or legal advisors. They had taken the entire second floor of the inn, and the innkeeper had been generously compensated for his discretion. Most telling of all, they had booked their rooms for 2 weeks, far longer than would be necessary for a simple diplomatic courtesy call. Alexander had also spent considerable time that morning reviewing historical records and correspondence related to Lord Blackthorne's dealings with the crown. What he discovered painted a complex picture of a man who was undeniably brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious, but also genuinely committed to the prosperity of Eldoria. Blackthorne's estates produced nearly a quarter of the kingdom's grain. His mines provided essential metals for both tools and weapons, and his merchant connections had established trade routes that brought exotic goods and foreign currency into the realm. The problem wasn't that Blackthorne was a bad man. It was that he was a man who understood power and wasn't afraid to use it. And, right now, he held more power over the royal family than perhaps anyone else in the kingdom. The inn's private dining room was elegantly appointed, with dark wood paneling and a crackling fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Lord Blackthorne rose as Alexander entered, offering a bow that was respectful but not subservient. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothing was expensive but understated, the mark of a man who didn't need to display his wealth because his reputation spoke for itself. "Your Highness," Blackthorne said, his voice warm and cultured, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I trust your father is in good health." "He is well, thank you," Alexander replied, settling into the chair across from Blackthorne. A servant poured wine for both men before discreetly withdrawing, leaving them alone. "Though I must admit, I'm curious about the timing of your visit. It's been some months since you've graced the court with your presence." Blackthorne smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Direct as always, Your Highness. I appreciate that quality in you. It will serve you well when you ascend to the throne. Yes, I have been absent from court, managing various business concerns in my northern territories. But recent developments have made it necessary for me to return and address certain delicate matters with your family." "Delicate matters?" Alexander kept his voice neutral, giving no indication that he had any idea what Blackthorne might be referring to. "Indeed." Blackthorne took a sip of his wine, studying Alexander over the rim of his goblet. "Your Highness, I believe in speaking plainly, particularly when discussing matters that could affect the stability of our beloved kingdom. I have in my possession certain correspondence that details arrangements made between myself and Lady Victoria during the difficult period following your mother's tragic death." Alexander felt his pulse quicken, but he maintained his composure. "I'm afraid I don't understand. What sort of arrangements?" "Arrangements that were necessary for the survival of Eldoria," Blackthorne said, leaning forward slightly. "Your Highness, your father is a good king and an honorable man, but during his period of grief, he was, shall we say, not entirely focused on the practical necessities of ruling a kingdom that was facing potential famine, military threats, and economic collapse. And so you took it upon yourself to make arrangements with Lady Victoria?" Alexander's tone carried just a hint of steel. "Lady Victoria approached me," Blackthorne corrected gently. "She understood, as I did, that sometimes the survival of a kingdom requires actions that may not appear entirely proper when examined out of context. The grain shipments that prevented starvation in the eastern provinces, the weapons that helped our forces secure the border with Moravia, the trade agreements that restored prosperity to our merchants, all of these were the result of quick, decisive action taken when the official channels of government were compromised by grief. Alexander studied Blackthorn's face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only what appeared to be genuine conviction. And these letters document these arrangements. They do. In considerable detail. Blackthorn's expression grew more serious. They also document the methods by which these arrangements were implemented, the considerations that changed hands, and the promises that were made for future cooperation. Taken out of context, they could easily be misinterpreted as evidence of treasonous conspiracy. But you don't see them that way. I see them as evidence of patriotic action taken during a national crisis, Blackthorn said firmly. But I'm not naive, Your Highness. I understand that political enemies could use these letters to destroy Lady Victoria's reputation and call into question every decision your father has made since his remarriage. They could claim that the Queen has been acting as my agent within the royal household, that she has been influencing policy for my benefit rather than the kingdom's. Alexander set down his wine goblet, meeting Blackthorn's gaze directly. And what is it that you want, Lord Blackthorn? Surely you didn't request this meeting simply to explain the existence of these letters. For the first time, Blackthorn's composed facade showed a crack of what might have been genuine emotion. What I want, Your Highness, is to ensure the continued stability and prosperity of Eldoria. These letters represent a threat to that stability, not because of what they actually document, but because of how they could be misused by those who would seek to destabilize the crown. So you're offering to destroy them? I'm offering to ensure they never see the light of day, Blackthorn said carefully, in exchange for certain considerations that would benefit both my interests and the interests of the kingdom. Such as, Blackthorn leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. The position of Chancellor of the Exchequer has been vacant for 2 months. My nephew, Lord Geoffrey Blackthorn, is eminently qualified for the position. He studied finance at the University of Cambridge, has managed the books for several of my most profitable enterprises, and has a deep understanding of both domestic and international trade. His appointment would ensure that the kingdom's finances are managed by someone who understands the complex web of relationships that actually drive our economy. Alexander nodded slowly. And if this appointment is not made, then I fear these letters might find their way into the hands of those who would use them to create chaos and uncertainty. Lord Ashford, for instance, has been quite vocal in his criticism of your father's recent policies. I believe he would find these documents very interesting indeed. Lord Ashford was the leader of the minority faction within the Noble Council, a group of traditionalist nobles who opposed many of King Edward's reforms and had been vocal in their criticism of his marriage to Victoria. If these letters fell into Ashford's hands, he would undoubtedly use them to launch a full-scale political attack on the royal family. You're threatening my family, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I'm offering to protect your family, Blackthorn countered. Your Highness, I have no desire to see the kingdom thrown into chaos. I profited greatly during the years of peace and prosperity under your father's rule, and I have every intention of continuing to do so. But I also will not allow my own interests to be threatened by political instability. And you believe that appointing your nephew to such a crucial position will ensure this stability? I believe that having someone in that position who understands the true nature of how this kingdom's economy functions will ensure that the policies implemented are practical and effective rather than idealistic and destructive. Blackthorn's tone grew more passionate. Your Highness, I've watched kingdoms rise and fall based on their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Eldoria's strength lies not in its military might or its natural resources, but in its ability to form practical alliances and make pragmatic decisions. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering everything he had heard. Blackthorn's position was sophisticated. He wasn't simply demanding a favor in exchange for his silence. He was arguing that his nephew's appointment would actually benefit the kingdom, and that the alternative, political chaos resulting from the revelation of Victoria's secret arrangements, would be far more damaging than placing a qualified candidate in an important position. I'll need to discuss this with my father, Alexander said finally. Of course, but, Your Highness, I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor here. Lord Ashford has been asking pointed questions about various trade arrangements and financial decisions made over the past 3 years. I believe he may already suspect that there were unofficial channels of communication between the Crown and certain noble houses. If he were to discover concrete evidence. How long? Alexander asked bluntly. I can ensure these letters remain secure for 1 week, Blackthorn said. After that, I may not be able to control who gains access to them. Alexander stood, and Blackthorn rose as well. Lord Blackthorn, I appreciate your directness in this matter. You'll have your answer within the week. I hope, Your Highness, that you understand I take no pleasure in this situation. Lady Victoria is a remarkable woman who acted with courage and wisdom during a very difficult time. I would hate to see her reputation destroyed by those who would twist her patriotic actions into something sinister. As Alexander prepared to leave, Blackthorn added one more comment that stopped the prince in his tracks. Your Highness, there is one other thing you should know. The letters also reference certain information about your mother's death that Lady Victoria felt it necessary to share with me at the time. Information that might be disturbing to your family. Alexander turned slowly. What sort of information? I believe that conversation is best had with Lady Victoria herself, Blackthorn said gently. But I thought you should be aware that the implications of these letters go beyond simple political arrangements. The carriage ride back to Ravenshollow Castle was one of the longest of Alexander's life. His mind raced with questions and possibilities, each more troubling than the last. What information about his mother's death could Victoria have shared with Blackthorn? What other secrets were hidden within those letters? As the castle came into view, its towers silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, Alexander realized that his meeting with Blackthorn had raised far more questions than it had answered. The game was becoming more complex, the stakes higher, and the potential consequences more devastating than he had initially imagined. But one thing had become crystal clear. If he was going to protect his family and his kingdom, he needed to understand the full scope of Victoria's secrets. And that meant having a very difficult conversation with his stepmother, regardless of the personal cost. The fate of the kingdom of Eldoria hung in the balance, and Alexander was beginning to understand that the choices made in the next few days would echo through history for generations to come. The castle's rose garden had been Queen Margaret's favorite retreat, a carefully cultivated sanctuary where she would spend hours tending to the blooms that now flourished in her memory. As Alexander walked the winding gravel paths between the flower beds, he reflected on how appropriate it was that he had chosen this place to confront Victoria about the secrets she had been keeping. His mother's presence seemed to linger here, and he found himself hoping that her spirit might guide him through the treacherous conversation that lay ahead. Victoria was kneeling beside a bed of white roses, her elegant hands carefully pruning the stems with a pair of silver shears. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was pulled back in a style that made her look younger than her 35 years. When she heard Alexander's footsteps on the gravel, she looked up with a smile that faltered slightly when she saw the serious expression on his face. Alexander, she said, rising gracefully and brushing the soil from her hands with a small towel. How lovely to see you. I was just thinking about your mother while working with her roses. She had such a gift with these plants. They still seem to respond to her touch, even after all this time. Victoria, we need to talk, Alexander said gently but firmly. About Lord Blackthorn, about the letters, and about secrets that have been kept for far too long. The color drained from Victoria's face, and she nearly dropped the pruning shears. For a moment, she seemed to consider denying everything, but then her shoulders sagged slightly in defeat. You know, she said quietly. How? I overheard your conversation with Father yesterday morning, Alexander admitted. I know about the arrangements you made with Blackthorn during the crisis after Mother's death. I know about the leverage he now holds over our family. And I know that there's something about Mother's death that you've kept hidden. Victoria sank onto a stone bench beside the rose bed, her hands trembling slightly. I never wanted you to find out this way, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted you to find out at all, if I could have prevented it. Alexander sat beside her on the bench, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to maintain the gravity of their conversation. Victoria, I need you to tell me everything. Not just about the political arrangements, but about what really happened to my mother. What information did you share with Blackthorn that could be so disturbing to our family? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the white roses that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion and old pain. Your mother didn't die in a riding accident, Alexander. At least, not the way we told everyone. Alexander felt the world tilt around him. What do you mean? Margaret was an expert rider, one of the best I've ever known. The idea that she would lose control of her horse on a familiar trail she had ridden hundreds of times, it never made sense. Victoria turned to face Alexander, her eyes bright, with unshed tears. The morning she died, she came to me with documents she had discovered hidden in your father's study. Financial records that showed significant amounts of money being transferred to unknown accounts, correspondence with foreign representatives that suggested negotiations your father had never mentioned to the council. Alexander's mind reeled. Are you saying father was involved in something illegal? No, Victoria said quickly. No, that's not what the evidence suggested at all. What Margaret discovered was that your father was secretly negotiating to prevent a war with Astoria, using his own personal funds to pay for intelligence and diplomatic backchannels that could avoid a conflict that would have cost thousands of lives. Then why the secrecy? Because there were members of the Noble Council who wanted that war, Alexander. Lord Ashford, Lord Pemberton, several others who stood to profit significantly from military contracts and territorial gains. If they had discovered that Edward was working to prevent the conflict, they would have accused him of treason, of putting the interests of a foreign power above those of his own kingdom. Alexander began to understand. So Mother discovered that father was actually trying to protect the kingdom, but in a way that could be twisted to make him look like a traitor. Exactly. And Margaret, being who she was, decided she needed to gather more evidence to protect your father from any potential accusations. She arranged to meet with a contact of hers, someone who had connections to foreign intelligence networks and could verify whether the negotiations were genuine peace efforts or something more sinister. Victoria paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. The meeting was supposed to take place at the old hunting lodge near Blackmore Falls. Margaret decided to ride there alone. She often rode alone, and no one thought anything of it. But when she didn't return by evening, search parties were sent out, and they found her with her neck broken, apparently thrown from her horse. They found her body at the bottom of a ravine, yes. But, Alexander, there were things about the scene that didn't make sense. Her horse was found grazing peacefully nearly a mile away, completely uninjured. The saddle showed no signs of damage or strain that would indicate a fall. And, most troubling of all, Margaret's private journal, which she always carried with her, was never found. Alexander felt sick. You think she was murdered? I think she was killed to prevent her from exposing something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. But not the something she thought she was investigating. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more determined. I think someone discovered that she was meeting with this intelligence contact and assumed the worst, that she was engaged in treasonous activity herself. Who? Who would have done such a thing? I don't know for certain, but I have my suspicions. Victoria looked directly into Alexander's eyes. The only people who knew about Margaret's investigation were myself, your father, who had no idea she had discovered his secret negotiations, and whoever she might have told about her plans. Alexander's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what Victoria was telling him. This is what you told Blackthorn. When your father retreated into his grief after Margaret's death, and the kingdom began to face multiple crises simultaneously, I was desperate. I needed help, I needed resources, and I needed someone I could trust who had the connections and influence to stabilize the situation. Roderick Blackthorn was that person. But why did you tell him about Mother's death? Victoria stood and walked to the edge of the garden, where a stone wall overlooked the valley below. Because I needed him to understand why I was so determined to protect your father and preserve the stability of the kingdom. And because I suspected that whoever was responsible for Margaret's death might try to strike again if they felt the royal family was vulnerable. And Blackthorn believed you? Roderick had his own intelligence networks. Within a week of our first meeting, he came back to me with additional evidence that supported my theory. Financial records showing unusual payments made just before and after Margaret's death. Travel documents indicating that certain nobles had been in the area around the time of the incident. Even testimony from local villagers who reported seeing armed men near the hunting trails that morning. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Did you ever find out who was responsible? We narrowed it down to a small group of suspects, but we could never gather enough concrete evidence to make accusations. And, as time went on, pursuing the investigation became more dangerous than letting sleeping dogs lie. The kingdom had stabilized, your father had recovered from his grief, and stirring up old secrets seemed likely to cause more harm than good. Until now. Victoria nodded grimly. Until now? Roderick is facing pressure from some very dangerous people, Alexander. There are forces within the kingdom and beyond our borders who would benefit from political chaos in Eldoria. They've been pressuring him to reveal the letters, to expose the arrangements we made, to create the kind of instability that would allow them to seize power or influence. And appointing his nephew as chancellor would protect him from this pressure. It would give him a legitimate reason to maintain his loyalty to the crown and resist those who would use him to destabilize the kingdom. Geoffrey Blackthorne is actually an excellent choice for the position, brilliant, honest, and completely committed to Eldoria's prosperity. His appointment would benefit the kingdom regardless of the political considerations. Alexander stood and joined Victoria at the stone wall, looking out over the peaceful valley that showed no signs of the political turmoil brewing within the castle walls. Victoria, if what you're telling me is true, then we're not just dealing with blackmail. We're dealing with a conspiracy that goes back years and may still be active. That's exactly what we're dealing with, Victoria confirmed. And I'm terrified, Alexander. Terrified that the same people who killed your mother might target your father, or you, or anyone else who gets too close to the truth. Then, we need to be very careful about how we handle this situation, Alexander said thoughtfully. Blackthorne isn't our enemy. He's actually trying to protect us from our real enemies. But he's also in a position where he has to protect himself and his own interests. What are you thinking? Alexander was quiet for a moment, formulating a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. I'm thinking that it's time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. If there really is a conspiracy against the royal family, if there are people who murdered my mother and would kill again to achieve their goals, then we need to expose them before they can strike again. That's incredibly dangerous, Alexander. We're talking about people who have already committed murder and who have the resources and connections to make more people disappear. Which is exactly why we can't continue to hide from them, Alexander said firmly. Victoria, you and Blackthorne have been protecting secrets for 3 years, trying to maintain stability by keeping dangerous truths hidden. But secrets have a way of coming to light eventually. And when they do, the damage is often worse than if the truth had been revealed from the beginning. Victoria studied Alexander's face, seeing the determination and intelligence that reminded her so much of Queen Margaret. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we take control of the situation. We're going to give Lord Blackthorne exactly what he's asking for. His nephew will be appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. But we're also going to use that appointment as the beginning of our own investigation into whoever killed my mother and whoever is still threatening our family. How? Alexander turned to face Victoria fully, his eyes bright with the fire of purpose. Because Geoffrey Blackthorne, as Chancellor, will have access to all of the kingdom's financial records, including records that might reveal who has been making unusual payments, who has been funding covert activities, and who has the resources and motivation to orchestrate the kind of conspiracy we're dealing with. Victoria's eyes widened as she began to understand the brilliance of Alexander's plan. You're going to use Blackthorne's own demands to investigate the very people who are pressuring him. Exactly. And more than that, we're going to make sure that when we expose these people, we have all the evidence we need to ensure they can never threaten our family again. Alexander's voice grew harder. Whoever killed my mother thought they could hide behind political chaos and noble privilege. They're about to learn that they were very, very wrong. As the sun began to set over the valley, casting long shadows across the rose garden, Alexander and Victoria stood together in a moment of shared understanding. The game was about to change dramatically, and for the first time since this crisis began, they were going to be the ones setting the rules. But neither of them could have predicted just how dangerous their enemies would prove to be, or how far those enemies would go to protect their own dark secrets. The Blue Salon had witnessed countless important meetings throughout the centuries, but few had carried the weight of the gathering that took place on that crisp autumn evening. King Edward sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face grave but resolute as he listened to Alexander recount everything he had learned about Victoria's secret arrangements, Lord Blackthorne's ultimatum, and, most shocking of all, the truth about Queen Margaret's death. Victoria sat beside the king, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally adding details or clarifications to Alexander's account. Across from them, Alexander had arranged for 3 other people to join this clandestine meeting. Sir Richard Whitmore, the kingdom's most trusted spymaster, Lady Catherine Mills, the royal family's legal advisor, and, most surprisingly, Lord Geoffrey Blackthorne himself, who had arrived at the castle under cover of darkness at Alexander's personal invitation. Geoffrey Blackthorne was a man in his early 30s, with the intelligent eyes and composed bearing that seemed to run in his family. Unlike his uncle, however, Geoffrey possessed a earnestness and moral clarity that Alexander had found immediately appealing during their private conversation earlier that day. When Alexander had approached him with a proposition that went far beyond his simple appointment as chancellor, Geoffrey had listened with growing excitement and determination. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," King Edward said, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious emotional strain of learning about his wife's murder. "You're proposing that we not only accede to Lord Blackthorn's demands, but that we use Geoffrey's appointment as chancellor to conduct our own investigation into Margaret's death and the conspiracy that may still threaten our family." "That's exactly what I'm proposing, Father," Alexander replied. "But it's more than just an investigation. We're going to systematically expose and neutralize every person involved in this conspiracy, regardless of their rank or position." Sir Richard leaned forward, his weathered face showing both admiration and concern. "Your Highness, the scope of what you're describing is enormous. We're potentially talking about members of the noble council, foreign agents, wealthy merchants, perhaps even other royal houses. The risks of doing nothing are greater," Alexander interrupted. "Sir Richard, these people murdered my mother and have been manipulating events in this kingdom for years. They're not going to simply disappear because we ignore them. They're going to continue to threaten everything we hold dear until we stop them." Lady Catherine, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had served the royal family faithfully for over 2 decades, spoke up. "From a legal perspective, Your Highness, we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. Any evidence we gather must be obtained through proper channels, and any accusations we make must be supported by irrefutable proof. Otherwise, we risk being accused of the very crimes we're trying to expose." "Which is where Geoffrey's role becomes crucial," Alexander said, turning to the younger Blackthorn. "Geoffrey, tell them about your discoveries." Geoffrey cleared his throat and opened a leather portfolio he had brought with him. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, when my uncle asked me to prepare for the possibility of being appointed chancellor, I took the liberty of conducting a preliminary analysis of the kingdom's financial records. What I found was disturbing." He spread several documents across the table, pointing to specific entries as he spoke. "There have been systematic irregularities in government spending over the past 4 years. Funds allocated for infrastructure projects that were never completed, payments to contractors who don't appear to exist, transfer of treasury money to accounts that can't be traced to any legitimate purpose." King Edward studied the documents with growing alarm. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservatively, nearly 200,000 gold sovereigns," Geoffrey replied. "That's enough to fund a small army, buy significant political influence, or finance extensive covert operations." Victoria gasped. 200,000? That's nearly 10% of the annual royal treasury. "And the irregularities began just 2 months before Queen Margaret's death," Geoffrey added significantly. "Someone was preparing for a major operation, and they needed substantial funding to carry it out." Sir Richard was examining the documents with professional interest. "Geoffrey, you mentioned contractors who don't appear to exist. Do you have names?" "Several. But, more importantly, I have the authorization signatures that approve these payments." Geoffrey pulled out another document. Every single fraudulent payment was authorized by the same person, Lord Ashford, in his capacity as acting chancellor during the period after Chancellor Morrison's death and before his replacement was appointed. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Lord Ashford had been one of the most vocal critics of King Edward's policies and his marriage to Victoria. If he was also embezzling funds from the royal treasury. "My God," King Edward breathed. "Ashford has been stealing from the crown while publicly criticizing my financial management." "It gets worse, Father," Alexander said grimly. "Geoffrey, tell them about the timing of these payments." Geoffrey consulted his notes. The largest single payment, 50,000 sovereigns, was authorized 3 days before Queen Margaret's death. It was supposedly for special security services related to protecting the royal family during a period of increased tension with Astoria. "Security services that were never provided," Sir Richard observed. "Your Majesty, I oversaw all legitimate security arrangements during that period. No external contractors were hired, and certainly not at that price." Lady Catherine was taking careful notes. "This gives us a clear motive and opportunity. But we still need to establish direct connections between these financial irregularities and Queen Margaret's death." "That's where the second part of our investigation comes in," Alexander said. "Victoria, tell them about the intelligence network." Victoria took a deep breath before speaking. "When I began working with Lord Blackthorn to stabilize the kingdom after Margaret's death, he shared some of his intelligence resources with me. We've maintained surveillance on several suspicious individuals over the past 3 years, including Lord Ashford and his associates. She paused, looking at each person around the table. 2 weeks ago, that surveillance paid off. Ashford met secretly with a representative of the Moravian Intelligence Service at a hunting lodge outside the capital. The same hunting lodge where Margaret was supposed to meet her contact on the day she died. The implications of this revelation hit everyone simultaneously. Not only was Lord Ashford embezzling from the crown, but he was also meeting with agents of a foreign power that had been in conflict with Eldoria for years. Do we have proof of this meeting? Lady Catherine asked. We have eyewitness testimony from Blackthorn's agents, and we have documents that were exchanged during the meeting, Victoria replied. Documents that detail plans to destabilize the Eldorian government through a series of political scandals and economic crises. King Edward's face was pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. They're planning to destroy us systematically. The revelation of Victoria's letters would just be the beginning. Exactly, Alexander confirmed. But now we have the opportunity to turn their own weapons against them. Geoffrey's appointment as Chancellor gives us legitimate access to all financial records, and his investigation will reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, we use Blackthorn's intelligence network to gather additional evidence of treasonous activities. Geoffrey spoke up. Your Majesty, I should mention that my preliminary analysis suggests the financial irregularities may extend beyond Lord Ashford. There are payment patterns that suggest coordination with other members of the Noble Council, and possibly with merchant houses that have trade relationships with foreign governments. How many people are we talking about? King Edward asked. Potentially a dozen or more highly placed individuals, including several members of Parliament, and at least 2 other Noble Council members, Geoffrey replied. Sir Richard whistled low. This isn't just a conspiracy, it's a full-scale infiltration of the government, which is why we need to be extraordinarily careful about how we proceed, Alexander said. We can't simply arrest everyone at once, because we don't yet know the full extent of the network. If we move too quickly, we risk allowing key conspirators to escape or destroy evidence. Lady Catherine nodded. We need a systematic approach. Gather evidence methodically, build airtight cases against each individual, and then coordinate simultaneous arrests to prevent communication between conspirators. How long will this take? King Edward asked. If we do it properly? 6 to 8 months, Alexander replied. Geoffrey will need that much time to thoroughly analyze the financial records and trace all the fraudulent payments. Meanwhile, we'll be gathering intelligence on meetings, communications, and activities that demonstrate treasonous intent. Victoria looked worried. But what about the immediate threat? Your uncle is under pressure to reveal the letters within a week. Geoffrey smiled for the first time during the meeting. Actually, I think I can help with that. My uncle's primary concern is protecting himself and his interests from those who would use him to destabilize the kingdom. If I'm appointed Chancellor, and if he knows that we're actively investigating the very people who have been pressuring him, he'll have every reason to keep the letters secure. And if the pressure on him increases? Sir Richard asked. Then, we'll make sure he has protection, Alexander said firmly. Sir Richard, I want Lord Blackthorn placed under discreet royal protection immediately. If anyone attempts to threaten or coerce him, I want to know about it instantly. As the meeting continued into the late evening, the participants worked out the details of what would become one of the most complex and dangerous investigations in the kingdom's history. They established communication protocols, assigned specific responsibilities, and created contingency plans for various scenarios. But even as they planned, none of them could have anticipated just how ruthless their enemies would prove to be. The conspiracy they were uncovering had been years in the making, involved dozens of powerful individuals, and extended far beyond the borders of Eldoria itself. The game they were about to play would determine not just the fate of the royal family, but the future of the entire kingdom. And their enemies were already planning their next move. As the participants prepared to leave the Blue Salon, King Edward spoke one final time. I want everyone to understand the gravity of what we're undertaking. We are about to challenge some of the most powerful people in the kingdom, people who have already shown they're willing to commit murder to protect their interests. The risks to all of us, and to our families, are enormous. He paused, looking each person in the eye. But Margaret deserves justice. Our kingdom deserves to be free from those who would destroy it from within. And our children deserve to inherit a realm that is truly secure and prosperous. Alexander felt a surge of pride and determination as he listened to his father's words. The boy who had hidden behind tapestries to eavesdrop on conversations was gone, replaced by a man ready to fight for everything he held dear. The war for the soul of Eldoria was about to begin, and Alexander intended to win it. The great hall of Ravenshollow Castle had never witnessed a scene quite like the one that unfolded on that gray December morning, exactly 6 months after the secret meeting in the Blue Salon. The ancient stone walls, which had seen the rise and fall of dynasties, the celebration of victories, and the mourning of defeats, now bore witness to what would become known as the most significant political reckoning in Eldoria's history. 23 individuals stood in chains before the throne, their noble titles and wealthy positions stripped away to reveal them as traitors to the crown. Among them was Lord Ashford, his once proud bearing now reduced to sullen defiance, Lady Pemberton, whose tears had not moved the court to mercy, and, most shocking of all, Duke Aldrich, King Edward's own cousin, whose betrayal had cut deepest of all. Alexander stood beside his father's throne, wearing the formal robes of the crown prince, his face grave but satisfied as he surveyed the results of their careful investigation. Beside him, Victoria wore the crown jewels for the first time since their wedding, her presence now universally recognized as legitimate and beneficial to the kingdom. At a table near the throne sat Geoffrey Blackthorne, now firmly established as Chancellor of the Exchequer, surrounded by the meticulously organized evidence that had brought down the largest conspiracy in the kingdom's recorded history. King Edward rose from his throne, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall as he addressed the assembled nobles, citizens, and foreign representatives who had gathered to witness justice being served. 6 months ago, the king began. We discovered that our beloved Queen Margaret had not died in an accident, but had been murdered by conspirators who sought to destabilize and ultimately destroy the kingdom of Eldoria. Today, we see before us the architects of that conspiracy and of numerous other crimes against the crown and the people of this realm. The king's voice grew stronger as he continued. The evidence against these individuals is overwhelming and irrefutable. They embezzled nearly 300,000 gold sovereigns from the royal treasury, money that belonged to the people of Eldoria and was meant to fund schools, roads, hospitals, and defenses that would protect our citizens. They conspired with foreign agents to sell military secrets and trade intelligence that would have given our enemies significant advantages in any future conflicts. Alexander stepped forward slightly, his own voice adding weight to the accusations. Most damning of all, these conspirators arranged for the murder of Queen Margaret when they discovered that she was investigating their treasonous activities. They killed a beloved queen and mother, and they would have killed again to protect their conspiracy. The evidence that Geoffrey had methodically assembled over the past months was staggering in its scope and detail. Financial records showed not just embezzlement, but systematic bribery of government officials, payments to foreign agents, and the funding of mercenary groups that had carried out various crimes including the Queen's murder. Communications intercepted by Lord Blackthorne's intelligence network revealed detailed plans to create political chaos that would allow the conspirators to seize control of key government positions. Perhaps most shocking of all, the investigation had revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond Eldoria's borders. Representatives from 3 neighboring kingdoms had been actively supporting and coordinating with the traitors, seeing an opportunity to weaken or even partition Eldoria among themselves. Duke Aldrich, as the highest-ranking conspirator, was given the opportunity to speak before sentence was pronounced. His words, rather than showing remorse, revealed the depths of his arrogance and the twisted justification he had created for his crimes. "Edward, you have always been weak," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "You married for love instead of political advantage. You sought peace when war would have brought glory and expansion. You trusted advisors who cared more about the common people than about maintaining the natural order of nobility and power." The Duke's eyes blazed with unrepentant fury. "We sought to restore Eldoria to greatness, to place it under the leadership of those who understood that true strength comes from decisive action, not from endless consultation and democratic idealism. Margaret discovered our plans and threatened to destroy everything we had worked for. Her death was necessary for the greater good of the kingdom." The gasps of horror that echoed through the great hall were audible even in the furthest reaches of the vast room. To hear a member of the royal family openly admit to ordering the murder of the Queen shocked even those who had known of the conspiracy's existence. King Edward's response was measured but devastating. Aldrich, you speak of greatness while describing treason. You claim to serve the kingdom while stealing from its treasury and selling its secrets to foreign enemies. You invoke the natural order of nobility while plotting the murder of your own family members. The king paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. True greatness comes from service, from sacrifice, from putting the welfare of others before your own ambition. You and your conspirators represent everything that is base and dishonorable about the abuse of power and privilege. The sentences, when they came, were swift and severe. The 23 conspirators were stripped of all titles and properties, which would be redistributed to those who had suffered from their crimes. 15 of them, including all those directly involved in Queen Margaret's murder, were sentenced to death. The remaining 8, whose roles were primarily financial, received life imprisonment with hard labor. Duke Aldrich and Lord Ashford, as the ringleaders of the conspiracy, received an additional punishment that had not been imposed in Eldoria for over a century. Their family names would be stricken from all official records, their coats of arms destroyed, and their bloodlines forever barred from holding any position of trust within the kingdom. But perhaps the most significant moment of the entire proceeding came when King Edward announced the establishment of new institutions designed to prevent future conspiracies from taking root. Today marks not just the end of one conspiracy, but the beginning of a new era of transparency and accountability in Eldorian governance, the king declared. We are establishing the Royal Office of Financial Oversight, which will conduct regular audits of all government expenditures and report directly to Parliament and the people. We are creating the Intelligence Coordination Council, which will ensure that information about threats to the kingdom is shared appropriately among all relevant agencies. Alexander stepped forward to announce his own contribution to these reforms. Additionally, we are establishing the Queen Margaret Institute for Governmental Ethics, which will train future government officials in the principles of honest service and will investigate any allegations of corruption or abuse of power. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Queen Margaret's death would not be remembered merely as a tragedy, but as the catalyst for reforms that would strengthen and protect the kingdom for generations to come. As the formal proceedings concluded and the convicted conspirators were led away to await the execution of their sentences, Alexander found himself standing with Victoria on the castle's main balcony, looking out over the kingdom they had fought so hard to protect. It's over, Victoria said softly, but with obvious relief. After all these months of investigation and preparation, it's finally over. This part is over, Alexander corrected gently. But, in many ways, our real work is just beginning. Rooting out this conspiracy was the easy part compared to rebuilding the trust and stability that they tried to destroy. Victoria nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. The kingdom is safe, but keeping it safe will require constant vigilance and constant dedication to the principles my mother believed in, Alexander added. Transparency, service, and the belief that government exists to serve the people, not to enrich those who hold power. As they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun break through the winter clouds to illuminate the valley below, Alexander reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he had first overheard Victoria's desperate conversation with his father. The frightened young man who had hidden behind tapestries had been replaced by a prince who was ready to face any threat to his kingdom and his family. The letters that had started this entire crisis had been publicly released as part of the evidence against the conspirators, but rather than damaging Victoria's reputation, they had revealed her to be a woman of courage and wisdom who had acted decisively during the kingdom's darkest hour. Public opinion had swung strongly in her favor, and she was now seen as one of the most capable and respected members of the royal family. Lord Blackthorne had been formally pardoned for any irregular activities he might have engaged in during the crisis period and had been awarded the kingdom's highest honor for his crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. His nephew Geoffrey had proven to be an exceptional chancellor, implementing financial reforms that had not only recovered the stolen funds but had actually improved the kingdom's fiscal position significantly. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation had revealed the true extent of foreign interference in Eldorian affairs, leading to the exposure and expulsion of dozens of enemy agents and the strengthening of relationships with legitimate allied kingdoms who had been equally threatened by the conspiracy. As Alexander and Victoria prepared to return inside for the celebration feast that would mark the end of the crisis, a messenger arrived with news that brought smiles to both their faces. The neighboring kingdoms of Astoria and Valenhall had formally requested negotiations for expanded trade agreements and mutual defense treaties, recognizing that Eldoria's stability and prosperity made it an ideal partner. Mother would be proud, Alexander said quietly, thinking of Queen Margaret's lifelong dedication to peace and diplomacy. She would indeed, Victoria agreed. But I think she would be most proud of the man you've become, Alexander. The courage and wisdom you've shown throughout this crisis. That's the legacy she hoped to leave in you. As they walked back into the warmth and light of Raven's Hollow Castle, Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The kingdom was secure, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. But, more than that, they had proven that even the most complex and dangerous conspiracies could be defeated by people who were willing to work together, take risks, and never lose sight of what they were truly fighting for. The moment when Prince Alexander had uncovered Lady Victoria's secret had indeed changed everything. But, in the end, it had changed everything for the better, leading not to the destruction of the kingdom, but to its renewal and strengthening. The kingdom of Eldoria would face future challenges, as all kingdoms must. But it would face them with leaders who had been tested by crisis and proven their commitment to the principles of justice, service, and truth. And, in the royal archives, the story of Queen Margaret's murder and the conspiracy that followed would be carefully preserved, not as a source of shame or secrecy, but as a reminder that vigilance and courage are the eternal price of freedom and justice. The game had been won, but the work of building a better kingdom would continue for generations to come. And Alexander, now seasoned by triumph over seemingly impossible odds, was ready to lead that work with wisdom, determination, and an unwavering commitment to the values his mother had died protecting.